What's really happening is we are showing up at a place where the wonder of power meets the suffering of truth. The reason why we talk about this is because as humans, our power is limited. We have limited power. None of us have control over everything. No matter how badly we might want to affect change in particular ways, there's a limit to what any of us can do. And when we tell the truth about those limitations, we are almost always naming an injustice. We are seeing that power is not distributed evenly. We are seeing that some of the choices we have made about how we wield our own power have caused suffering for others, have caused oppression. And it's important to be able to tell the truth about that. So in our stories today, we have these two examples of two different kinds of power at work. And what we need to keep in mind is that none of them are bad or evil on the face of them. Power is just power. It's like water. Water can be soothing and nourishing in a river, and you can drink it and swim in it. Or it can be catastrophic, and it can bulldoze homes. That's power. That's the same with power. And we have to understand our relationship to the power we wield. Our Bible stories today are invitations to explore human power. You'll notice that when I was telling these stories to the kids, God's name was never invoked. We never talked about God. And that's because God is not present in these stories in a visible, tangible way. These stories are very much about humans, how humans choose to wield power. And we see the shortcomings of that. Moses wants to end the injustice for the Hebrew slaves. He kills a man. And not only does it not do anything to end the injustice, it just leads to guilt and shame on his part, being rejected by the very people he was trying to help. And it leads to him running away, escaping the injustice altogether. It's only later on in life that Moses will realize these are not people who needed him to come in and wield his power to beat up someone or murder someone or try to end their injustice in that way. He'll come to realize that what these people really needed, what ended the injustice finally, was his ability to exercise this power of presence. Another way we might talk about it is relational power. So rather than power to affect others, relational power is our ability to be affected, to receive information from others, to be changed, to be moved. It's by using that power that Moses is able to go back to Egypt and stand present with these slaves, and together they find a way of not violently overthrowing their oppressors, but walking out of slavery into the wilderness of freedom. The story of Jesus, we see that same agency, that same power to affect change. This time it's in Peter. Peter is hearing about all these horrible things that are going to happen to Jesus. And he says, Jesus, it can't be true. Make it not so. This can't happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Strong words for a man who only wants to see his teacher not be horribly murdered. But it's because Jesus has done the work that all of us are called to do at this point of injustice. Jesus has integrated these two forms of power. He understands his power of agency, and he also understands this relational power, this power of empathy, this power of feeling with other people. We think of empathy as an emotion. It's not. It's an ability. It's an ability that takes practice. It's the ability to feel with others. And because Jesus has both an understanding of what he as a person is able to do, and he has the empathy to feel with others in the situations of injustice, he no longer sees it as a question of who has power and who doesn't. He, rather, is able to see that everyone plays a role in injustice. Everyone has a role to play. That's why he's asking, what are people saying about me? Who do they say that I am? And the disciples are saying, some people think you're John the Baptist, some people think you're a prophet. Peter says, I think you're the Messiah. And the only title that Jesus ever claims for himself is the title Son of Man. It's a very particular role that he feels called to play. And it's the role of the person who will expose the limitations of earthly power. He will go to the cross and be crucified for crimes he did not commit, in order to reveal the unstoppable forgiveness of God, the ever-present and ever-growing relational power of God, and expose it for all time, so that all the world will know that is a more powerful way of wielding power than any other kind of agency that we might feel. So friends, this is where we find ourselves, having to wrestle with injustice, having to sit and understand our own power and figure out how to integrate it so that we know how to respond to injustice. It sounds heavy and hard, but as we've talked about, every single point along the way has both challenges and gifts. The challenge of this stage is to face our own indifference to injustice, our own indifference to suffering. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And we have a lot of ways that we practice indifference. Sometimes we will refuse to look at an injustice. We'll hear people crying, we'll hear that they're suffering, but we'll turn a blind eye and say, I don't know if that's really a problem, and I don't know if it's really a problem for me, and I don't know if I really have any ability to do anything about it. That's practicing indifference. In order to face injustice, in order to walk this way of life that introduces us to love of God, love of neighbor, love of ourselves, we have to practice empathy. We have to practice feeling with others in their suffering. We have to practice knowing that every injustice involves us, whether we want it to or not. We have a role to play. But we can do something better today than just having me stand here and describe this to you. We have a dear friend who can come forward and share a little bit of her story, and we'll find ways of sharing her more expanded story. But we would like to invite at this time Danielle Hoffman, a Kittery resident who helped put together the local chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice, so she can tell you what it feels like and what it looks like from her vantage point to be in this space. Thank you, Danielle.
Can you hear me now? Thanks everyone for having me here. So when Brian first reached out to us looking for someone to talk about how they were called to anti-racism work, my first thought was, that's great, let me put him in contact with someone else to do that. I'm comfortable with public speaking in general, but I'm still not super comfortable talking about this. Racism, anti-racism, and I think that's true. Well, I wanted to say, and that's why I'm going to be reading a lot of this, because it's tough stuff to just talk about. And I think it's true for most white folks raised in predominantly white New England. I don't know about you, but I was raised in an environment where we didn't talk about race. Racism was something that happened somewhere else. We saw it on the news. It happened from bad people. And I remember phrases like embrace diversity, but I don't remember anyone teaching me what that really meant. And I don't have any specific memories of this, but I can imagine that when I was in the grocery store, if I had commented on the color of someone's skin, I'm pretty sure my mother would have just shushed me and said, shh, we don't talk about that, or don't stare, and that would be the end of it. So by not discussing these things explicitly, I was taught the message that these weren't things to talk about. It wasn't polite. I was somehow bad or doing something wrong if I noticed how someone was different from me, even though it goes completely against our nature as human beings not to notice differences. It's part of our biology. So basically I was taught to be colorblind, and since I continued to live my whole life in predominantly white New England, it was pretty easy for me to keep following those rules. And now at the age of 42, I'm finally realizing why that was a problem, because here I am and I'm still not comfortable talking about this. So about a year ago, I happened to meet a neighbor who was very comfortable talking about this stuff, and we were both avid readers and had some things in common, so I enjoyed spending time with her, talking books. But some of the conversations were new to me. You know, she was reading books about how black people were being oppressed in our country. And this wasn't like 1800s America. She was talking about oppression right now in modern day America. And I think probably at first I was engaging in these discussions with her out of politeness. And I probably thought of racial oppression as a problem for black people to deal with, people of color to deal with. And if I'm honest, I probably was thinking at the time, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but if people would just work harder, they could fix it. They could, you know, make a better life for themselves. And then I found myself in my neighbor's feminist book club. I've never been a feminist. I've never been an activist of any kind. But heck, it's fun to read books and drink wine with other women, so there I was. And she was insistent that these books had to be intersectional, and that was like a big word, new word for me at the time. And basically what it meant is the books we were reading shouldn't focus on our perspective. We were white women who were financially secure, but if you're talking about feminism, feminism means different things to different people, and for some people, their experience as a woman is a lot different than mine. I have some power. Other people have a lot less. But you know, whatever, there will be wine there, so I'm going along with it. And the first book that was selected was a book called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. And as I read Debbie's story about exploring her white culture, her family history, and her efforts to rescue people of color from their terrible plight with her nice white lady solutions, and asking herself really hard questions as she realized why she was met with resistance and how she had been upholding systems that she didn't even realize she was participating in, I experienced a realization of my own. Debbie's life was a lot like mine. I definitely don't have the incredible wealth of her family, but you know, my family was definitely comfortable. And I learned that this was in a large part due to my grandfather's benefiting from the GI Bill. The GI Bill brought education and home ownership to many masses of white veterans, while at the same time denying those benefits to black veterans. I learned that my white grandfathers were able to buy their houses in neighborhoods where their home values would appreciate, creating wealth to be passed down to their families. I benefited from that. At the same time, families of color were denied access to homes in those neighborhoods with a process called redlining, where there were literally red lines drawn around the maps, and people of color couldn't buy there. So I came to understand that we live in a society specifically designed to benefit white people, and that it can be hard to accept on first reading. But you know, I couldn't let go of this message, and I'm the kind of person that needs to like dig really deep into something when I get interested in it. So I wanted to know the evidence behind everything. I wanted to know about the data supporting it. I went to government websites, I looked at their own statistics, and everything was true. And I started reading everything I could get my hands on. I checked sources so that I could make sure I was buying into the liberal propaganda. So, you know, I learned that black people are more likely to go to prison for the same exact offenses as white people. I learned that black children are more likely to be suspended from school. I learned that white families, on average, possess 7 times more wealth than black families, and that's a conservative estimate. And I learned that that number has barely budged since the time that black people were enslaved in this country. That's a pretty big deal. And I learned that the wealth gap is actually predicted to increase, not decrease over time, as we'd all like to think it would. So that's heavy, and it left me feeling ill. And I went through weeks of just like being really uncomfortable and thinking about this a lot. And I've heard the same thing from other people who are new to this work, that it really affects you. But you know, I've always thought of myself as a good person. I said, you know, I've never been an activist, but I've always believed in equal rights and having equal access, regardless of who you are or what you look like. And And I always kind of had this narrative in my brain that if I had been alive in the 60s, absolutely I would have participated in the civil rights movement, right? Because these were people, they couldn't vote, they couldn't marry, this was like concrete stuff, and it was not just. And of course, I would have marched, I would have protested for that. But here I was, right now, faced with the knowledge that inequality is still at issue, and that in America, right now, people of color are systemically discriminated against, and that there's basically this culture of white affirmative action where white people get benefits, but people of color don't. And so if I was someone who would have participated in that movement, what was my responsibility now, given the information I have right in front of me? So I had to put my money where my mouth was. With some other women in that book club, we formed a chapter of a national group called Showing Up for Racial Justice, and you might have seen some of our events in the community. We try to do education and facilitate discussions. And that was about a year ago. And so Brian also asked me to talk about the challenges and benefits of doing this work. I mean, I think I've probably already talked about some challenges, which is it's extremely uncomfortable. But the flip side of that, the advantage to that is I'm comfortable now with discomfort. I can bring up uncomfortable conversations to, you know, Uncle Billy at Thanksgiving when I don't agree with some joke that he made. That for years we've just been, you know, going, you know, rolling our eyes when he says it, but no one speaks up. Well, now I feel like I can speak up because I just feel strong enough to do that because I'm practicing and I'm learning and I'm watching other people speak about it and finding some words that help to communicate. You know, I feel insecure sometimes talking about this. You know, I'm a white person, I'm pretty privileged. What do I know about oppression? But on the flip side, I know that I have access to power. I joined the school committee so that I could bring a different point of view to hiring decisions or policies and make sure we're not just thinking about the white middle-class New England perspective when we're working on school issues. We can join boards, we can write letters to the editor, and it all takes time, but it can really pay off in taking the time to do this work. And just getting to know myself better. It's hard to think about your own internalized stereotypes, and we all have them, whether we want to admit to it or not. It's kind of liberating once you start to face it and realize, yeah, I have these internalized stereotypes and behaviors that I never thought about, but now that I know to be aware of them, I have this power to make different decisions. And I'm learning to unlearn my own culture, but I'm being mindful of learning to be a newer and better person. It's not convenient, you know, it's time consuming, but it pays off in so many other ways, so I guess that's it. So the group I'm with is called Showing Up for Racial Justice. If anyone's interested, I'm going to supply some information for Brian to put in a newsletter, but also we're doing events at the Community Center at Star Theater coming up pretty soon. There's going to be a film. We have one coming up in the Portsmouth Library and the South Berwick Library, so if you checked those schedules, you'd find ways to connect with us and have discussions if you're interested.